Our story begins at Sierra Leone, not far from the slave fort of Buns Island. The region has been terrorized by a small fleet of pirates, led by Captains Howell Davis, Jeremiah Cocklyn, and Olivier Levasseur. The pirates have just burned one of their old ships, and amazed by the spectacle of it, they decide to hold a feast. Not that they really need an excuse. Deep into the night, they drink. At 8:30, aboard the ship of Captain Davis, someone asks a slave to fetch some more rum from the hold. The slave climbs below into the utter darkness. Being unable to see, he lights a candle. Big mistake. He brings the flame too close to the bunghole of the rum barrel and sets it on fire. The first barrel sets the second on fire, as it had been carelessly left open, and both of them explode like a cannon. The slave is killed instantly. Next to the rum barrels are some casks of pitch and tar. If they are set on fire, the ship is doomed. The alarm is sounded. The music stops. The drinking ceases. The reaction is mixed. Some panic and jump into the boats or straight overboard into the river. Some just stood apprehensive on the railing, wishing to escape but not knowing how to swim, or proved afraid of the sharks. Confusion was only exasperated by the darkness and drunkenness. Others began to celebrate, cheering for a brave blast to go to hell with. The ship was packed with at least 30,000 pounds of gunpowder. Some were so frightened by this promise that they climbed out on the bowsprit, ironically bringing them closer to the magazine, stowed in the fore of the ship. Yet, in this time of need, 15 of the braver and perhaps more intelligent pirates set to extinguishing the flames. They fired the stern guns, demanding that all cowards return immediately. Next they pulled buckets of water from the river and covered the barrels of pitch and the powder room with wet blankets. With the threat of the fire quelled, they poised to extinguish the demon itself. In this effort, they are horribly scalded, but do not relent. Among these courageous firefighters is the ship's master, described by an eyewitness as brisk and courageous a man as ever I saw. At 10 o'clock at night, they declare the danger to be over. The surgeons are called to dress their burns. The name of the brave master was Rikard Taylor, and there is no better introduction to the biography of such an infamous and fascinating pirate. As courageous as he was brutal, and not too dissimilar from the fire he apparently did not fear. Easily angered, reckless, vengeful, borderline schizophrenic. But no fire starts from nothing. Even Taylor's fiery behavior had its sparks. Taylor had a tendency of invoking the curiosity and fascination of his captives. They often admired, borderline worshipped him. Despite being so feared by his men, he was usually quite courteous towards his captives. He would often engage them in friendly discussion, and one man, Jacob de Bucquoy, managed to learn and document some of the captain's origins. We know not when or where Taylor was born exactly, somewhere in England or its colonies. His first name is also uncertain. It appears to have been Richard, but some have called him William, John, and George. Neither do we know when or how he started his maritime career, but by his own admission, he was a naval officer during the reign of Queen Anne. His exact rank isn't certain. Some call him only an officer, others call him a captain. If we knew for certain, it would be possible to learn if he was born into high or low society. Regular seamen could rise to the rank of officer, seldom but sometimes to captain. These were known as tarpaulins. It would be easy to draw the conclusion that Taylor was a lowborn, owing to his violent tendencies, excessive swearing, and simply the need of turning to piracy to make a living. But there were plenty of pirates during this period who were gentlemen. Henry Jennings, Stede Bonnet, Palsgrave Williams, and Goldsmith who behaved very brutishly. Taylor did likewise claim that piracy was a life only befit the rabble. So neither idea, that Taylor was a lowborn risen through the ranks or a disgraced aristocrat, should be dismissed. In any case, he certainly had a reason to become vengeful and ambitious. His life as an officer was cut short. Taylor fell victim to political scheming, disgraced after a change of ministry. He harbored a bitter resentment against the English nation. What happened next is not entirely certain. In 1718, a man named Richard Taylor was on the list of pirates that surrendered to Captain Vincent Pearce at Nassau, New Providence, taking the royal pardon. In August of the same year, the same location, a deposition by one Richard Taylor from Philadelphia said that he was kidnapped and taken to the Bahamas by Spanish privateers. If these are the same person is uncertain, but it allows the imagination to run wild. Perhaps he had retired into a peaceful life, but was forced back into piracy by these privateers. Either way, his stay on Providence wasn't to last. His methods of climbing the social ladder were quite limited, and he was looking for the opportunity at getting back into the game. In July of 1718 arrived a new governor, Woodes Rogers, at the head of a small fleet. One of the vessels in the fleet was a sloop named Buck, briefly used during the unsuccessful pursuit of Charles Vane in his escape from Nassau. The next year in September, Rogers gave command of the Buck to Captain Brisk and designated her as a trading sloop. Though cooperation with the ex-pirates had proved difficult at first, Rogers had come to trust them and recruited several of their kind to crew the Buck. Perhaps not the best decision in hindsight. It's sort of like telling your dog to watch over the hot dogs. When the Buck reached Cuba, the pirates mutinied. What a surprise. They waited until the captain and his loyalists were asleep, and in spite of making a few threats, no one was actually killed. Welshman Howell Davis was elected captain, and among the pirates were some notable names like Walter Kennedy, who would later sail on the Roberts, and of course, Richard Taylor. He was seemingly made sailing master, arguably the most important role on the ship, as he'd be responsible for navigation. On smaller merchant vessels, the master was often the one in command. The position obviously required a lot of skill and education, which doesn't come as a surprise with the knowledge of Taylor's background as an officer. After a few attacks in the Caribbean, the pirates carried the Buck across the Atlantic to West Africa. Howell was a clever man who preferred deception over brutality. When they arrived in the Cape Verde Islands, he dressed in a red suit and introduced himself as a pirate hunter. One of their captives escaped, and Taylor gave him chase, managing to recruit the help of the locals with a basic knowledge of Portuguese. The captive knew not a single word of that language, and was unable to explain the truth of his situation. Back aboard the pirate sloop, he was ruthlessly whipped. The pirates continued southward, taking several prizes and exchanging the Buck for a large brigantine, naming her the Royal James in honor of the pretender to the English throne, James II. Many pirates of this period were staunch Jacobites, a political group seeking to restore the rule of James's dynasty, the Stuarts. Taylor was a Jacobite without a doubt, as he had been a loyal officer during the reign of the last Stuart sovereign, Anne, and had been disgraced after her death. The Royal James continued to the Gambia River, where they met and allied with another pirate ship, commanded by Olivier Levasseur, a French pirate and the subject of my last biography. The consort ship sailed next to Sierra Leone, where they met another pirate ship, commanded by an acquaintance of Levasseur, a short and angry fellow named Jeremiah Cocklyn. They joined forces and conquered a small company fort, taking several ships in the process. The fort had almost been reduced to rubble when the commander tried to escape. Cocklyn captured and put a pistol to his head, swearing at him for daring to resist. To his surprise, the commander responded with such a vile stream of insults, blasphemies, and curses that Cocklyn and his men could not help but laugh. Swearing was a mark of manlyhood among pirates, and they let the man go. Whilst plundering their prizes and burning what they didn't keep, the pirates spent a downtime drinking and feasting voraciously. It was during this debauchery that the fiery incident of the introduction transpired. It wasn't the only moment in which they almost blew themselves up. A few days prior, when celebrating the rechristening of a new flagship, several packs of musket cartridges were set on fire and exploded, blowing shot and fire everywhere. By some stroke of fortune, it hadn't set a magazine ablaze, located just below the cabin on this vessel. Cocklyn wished it had taken fire, for it, quote, would have been a noble blast to have gone to hell with. Let's just say he was a bit bonkers. The three captains formed an interesting dynamic. Howell was the most civil and compassionate, Cocklyn was absolutely insane, and Levasseur was somewhere in the middle, not being afraid to make a threat or even abuse, with an exception for his countrymen. A partnership between such strong personalities wasn't liable to last. You can ask my ex, especially since Cocklyn and Levasseur had a tendency of organizing mutinies against their competitors. Levasseur had previously deposed Benjamin Hornigold and Christopher Moody, and Cocklyn himself had been marooned after a failed mutiny. After a dispute over prize money, they conspired to finally have Howell deposed as well. They only needed a new candidate. Soon they would find one in Richard Taylor. Tensions were growing between Howell and Taylor. When the pirates were deceived by a group of Africans, Taylor resolved the issue by kidnapping the local chief, seemingly innocent, and tortured him to death by hoisting him into the rigging and using him as target practice. Taylor's resolve developed influence among the crew, and Davis was growing suspicious of the man's ambitions. Indeed, prompted by Jeremiah Cocklyn, Taylor and several supporters were conspiring to have Davis deposed. However, the plot leaked out. Davis was warned and had the conspirators cast out of his company. Davis then departed from the concert ship. Cocklyn, being more inclined to Taylor's treachery and brutality, welcomed him with open arms. As a reward for his conspiracy, he was given command of a Cocklyn spare ship, likely a maneuver to keep this ambitious intriguer appeased, but comfortably far away. These constant games of deception, mutiny, treachery, and brutality seems to have had a profound effect on Taylor's psyche. It's not dissimilar from what happened to Macbeth. Taylor was documented as suffering from paranoia and night terrors. Relatable? By learning of his origins, we can understand the deep-seated reasons for his behavior. Previous treacheries, no doubt harking so far back as to his humiliating disgracement in the Royal Navy. As you might remember from the video on Levasseur, the Frenchman has been credited with designing at least 7 pirate flags. Taylor was definitely not as flamboyant. He was only ever documented as flying the regular black flag with the skull and crossed bones, a plain red flag, and the St. George's cross from the ensign of his ship. At some point he may have used the banners of Jeremiah Cocklyn. One was a black flag with a skeleton, a skull and crossed bones, and an hourglass. Another a black flag with a skeleton stabbing a heart, used in conjunction with a red flag and an arm holding a sword. Then, a black flag with an arm holding a sword, skull and bones, and an hourglass. And most interestingly, the flag of England, with 4 balls in the quarter. Cocklyn, Buse, and Taylor would continue plaguing the Guinea coast. At Widder they captured a large vessel, the Victory, which Cocklyn took as his flagship. They kidnapped a surgeon named Richard Moore, who would accompany Taylor for the rest of his piratical career. It was now time to depart West Africa. Some evidence points to the pirates briefly having visited Brazil, but their true destination was around the Cape of Good Hope and the island of Madagascar. Levasseur split away from the concerts and was shipwrecked on the island of Mayotte. Cocklyn and Taylor sailed to St. Mary, the traditional pirate base of the Indian Ocean. It was believed that the legendary pirate Henry Every had built a castle on this island. In truth, it was a trading post run by Adam Baldridge. Several old pirates had since inherited this rogue factory, some of whom may have been Every's accomplices. They were soon joined by Every's biggest fan, a man named Edward England. He had recently taken a new ship and named her Fancy, in honor of Every's vessel. He no doubt pestered the old guard with all sorts of annoying questions. Either way, Cocklyn and England decided to join forces. If you watched my video on Madagascar, you'll know that the beautiful island was as deadly as it was alluring. European visitors would frequently drop dead from the heat and humidity, malaria, fever, or dysentery. Cocklyn died shortly after arrival. Whether he sweated or shat himself to death, we cannot know. Taylor took command in Cocklyn's stead, burning his old vessel and claiming the Victory as his new flagship. They spent several weeks partying and mending their ships before casting off. The pirates seem to have received news of 2 East Indiamen lying in the Bay of Juana on the island of Johanna, and went there to claim their prizes. Little did they know of the hot fight ahead of them. On the 17th of August, 1720, at 8 o'clock in the morning, the pirates entered the Bay of Juana on the island of Johanna, where they found a trio of East Indiamen. The 28-gun Cassandra, commanded by Captain James McCrae, the 32-gun Greenwich, commanded by Richard Kirby, and a 22-gun Ostender, Captain Anonymous. The companymen had learned about Levasseur's shipwreck on Mayotte and intended to go and capture him. Whilst making the final preparations, they were beset upon by the Fancy and Victory. Captain McCrae went aboard the Greenwich for a council of war. They noted that the individual pirate ships carried more guns, but they had 1 ship less than the company. Kirby and McCrae made a promise to stand each other by. They then unmoored their ships, got under sail, and towed the ships into position. The pirates did not even flinch. Things were about to go down. However, when the 2 fleets closed in, the Cassandra was deserted by her 2 allies, who pulled off and retreated. McCrae fired a shot at them, to no avail. He would have to engage the pirates alone, outnumbered and outgunned. They hoisted their black and bloody flags, yet the captain would not relent. Soon, the cannons roared. The firefight lasted for 3 hours. The pirates attempted to close in and board the Cassandra by rowing into position, but the company men managed to shoot the pirate oars to pieces. About 4 o'clock, most of the company officers and sailors on the quarterdeck had been killed or wounded. The Fancy was closing in, and the Greenwich was nowhere in sight. McCrae decided to head for the shore. The Fancy followed her. And though the Cassandra lay deeper in the water, the pirates managed to run aground on a sandbar, getting herself caught in the Cassandra's line of fire. The companymen got an angle on their bow, one of the weakest sections of the ship. The Victory had to supply their consort with reinforcements. Annoyingly, Captain Kirby was watching the fight from afar, and had he intervened, the company might have won. Instead, he finally cleared off to the open sea, completely disengaging from the battle. The Victory took out a warp, a large cable attached to an anchor, put it in a boat, steered the boat behind the Cassandra where they dropped the anchor, and then used their capstan to literally pull their ship behind the Cassandra. From this position, they would be able to bombard her to pieces. McCrae made note of the futility. Using the thick gun smoke as cover, he got most of his men into a longboat and rowed ashore. The rest had to swim. By 7 o'clock, the survivors had made it. The wounded were left behind aboard the Cassandra, where they were massacred. McCrae and his men escaped to the nearby town. The captain himself was almost dead with fatigue and blood loss, having been shot in the head by a musket. The results of the battle were absolutely gruesome. Captain Taylor said that blood had run out of the scuppers of the ship, and his crew lost 2/3 of its strength. According to Captain McCrae, the pirates suffered around 100 casualties, whereas the company had 13 killed and 25 wounded. Of course, McCrae had a bias in his report, as he was trying to not get fired by his superiors. Either way, the battle is quite amazing in that it's one of the few incidents in which the pirates of this period engaged in a heavily armed fight and survived, though barely. Whilst McCrae lay hiding and recovering, the pirates issued a bounty of $10,000 for anyone who brought them the captain's head, but few proved willing, since McCrae was close with the local sultan and his court. He spread a false report of his death, which somewhat subsided the pirates' fury. After 10 days, McCrae revealed himself. He and his men were poorly dressed and half-starved. England offered him amnesty and invited him aboard for a bowl of punch. Several of the pirates were quite unhappy over seeing this hard enemy who had caused them so much misery. Taylor was chief amongst them, but the bowl of punch had partly been served to keep him drunk and appeased. Whilst he was musing aloud on whether to end the captain there and then or not, a one-legged man with a terrible pair of whiskers and carrying a brace of pistols strode out on the deck and asked in a damning manner which one of them was Captain McCrae. McCrae expected this to be his executioner. Instead, the pirate took him by his hand and shook it, swearing that he was damn glad to see him, and that he would put down any man who'd so much as hurt a hair on the captain's head. Apparently the two had sailed together, and McCrae reported in his own deposition that he had several familiar faces among the pirate officers. Charles Johnson wrote in A General History that England and McCrae had been schoolmates. It shows how tiny the maritime world really was. Everyone knew everyone. The man with a wooden leg might be fictional, but he'd serve as inspiration for Stevenson's Long John Silver. England decided to give McCrae the Fancy, which was now torn to pieces from the engagement. He was even given some bales of cloth, but not even a rag from his own wardrobe. The Fancy was jury-rigged and departed for Arabia. In return, England took the Cassandra as his new flagship. Taylor likewise kidnapped a few of McCrae's officers, most prominently the first mate, Richard Lazenby, who would later provide a testimony of his time with the pirates. Why exactly he was kidnapped isn't certain. Though he was a skilled navigator, Taylor never put him to work. Maybe he was taken as a hostage, or to get insight into company affairs. But it doesn't seem like they got any actual use from him, so I'm gonna chalk it up to Taylor having a schizo episode. Though the pirates had tolerated McCrae's release, they could not accept England as a captain. He was removed from office and marooned on Madagascar along with 60 of his close supporters. England was widely known for his conscience and reportedly lived in suffering from all the pain he had caused. He retired on St. Mary's Island, living on welfare provided by other retired pirates. When the Navy arrived a few years later and tried to interrogate him for Taylor's whereabouts, England still refused to comply. He would die shortly thereafter. The new captain of the Cassandra was a mysterious pirate named Jasper Seeger. He's often conflated with Edward England, but by reading period records we can learn that they were separate individuals. But we know nothing about Seeger's origins, and why he was so important as to be made captain. Baylus C. Brooks has speculated that Seeger was an older sailor respected by the pirates, and possibly an old red seaman retired on Madagascar. Maybe even one of Every's crewmen, since a man named Seeger was documented aboard his ship. Around this time they also appear to have picked up Olivier Levasseur from his shipwreck at Mayotte. He appears to have been made an officer aboard Taylor's Victory, some even speculating that he was the angry quartermaster found aboard the ship, but it's not known for certain. They decided to sail north, to India, finally arriving in October of 1720. Here they encountered a pair of ships, perceiving them to be English. Taylor erupted into a schizo episode, demanding that Lazenby gave him the secret signals used by the company. Lazenby had no idea what he was talking about. Taylor started shaking his sword at him and called him a bunch of foul names. The ships turned out to be Indian. While plundering the Indians, an English fleet bore down on them. The Victory and Cassandra sailed straight through them, firing their broadsides and muskets in a ruthless drive-by, loading as fast as they could. The company ships were terrified, thinking the pirates were fire ships launched in a suicidal strike. Disorganized, they gave way for the assault, allowing the pirates to escape. When the local EIC officials caught wind of this, they got really mad. The pirates took several prizes along the coast before sailing to Cocklyn, where they traded with and were supplied by the Dutch. The Dutch VOC were quite happy with pirates plundering from their English rival, and were unscrupulous enough to make dealings with them. Sugar was traded for arak. The pirates gifted a fine table clock and a gold watch to the governor, and even threw gold coins to the boatmen delivering the goods. The Dutch went so far as to give them directions to English prizes. Aboard one of these ships, they captured a drunken captain who gave them some bothersome news. The drunkard said that the English fleet sent after them had been directed by their old friend, Captain McCrae. He was currently busy kitting out more ships against them. The pirates were furious. Unable to take out their vengeance on him, they damned Edward England in his stead, and turned next to poor Richard Lazenby. At the quartermaster's behest, Taylor beat him with his cane, since the quartermaster was, quote, lame of his hands. Some of the crewmen suggested they just let Lazenby go, to which Taylor stated, if they had a mind to let a dog go, that had heard all their designs for the ensuing year, he would never consent to it. Not that their plans were especially consistent to begin with. This occasioned a strong debate. Taylor was easily roused to anger, and he swore that if Lazenby was ever released, he would first cut off one of his limbs. Taylor's temper appears to have gotten the best of him, as he was seemingly voted out of office and replaced by the calmer and more experienced Olivier Levasseur. In order to appease him, Taylor was made quartermaster. Next they returned to Cocklyn, where they received news of McRae's fleet being in the vicinity, searching for them. A fleet did indeed show up, but it just departed without doing anything. Kind of anticlimactic. The pirates thought of it as a victory and rejoiced, quote, desiring none of McRae's company. What a ditch. It doesn't even seem to have been McRae and his boys, just some random fleet. But the pirates celebrated with a riotous Christmas, in which they devoured most of their provisions. In hindsight, gluttony wasn't the best idea. When they sailed next for the island of Mauritius, they had to ration the water and food to the extreme. Luckily they had some arrack and sugar to keep themselves sane. Lazenby, who was an East India officer, appears to have been appalled over the lack of discipline and organization among the pirates, which comes in stark contrast to the very positive account later given by Jacob de Bucquoy. That will be discussed when relevant. It was in a rather paltry condition that the pirates stumbled into the island of Mauritius. Half starved, half drunk, and high on sweet sugar. Sounds like me when writing these scripts. After repairing their ships, they sailed to Ile Bourbon, where they encountered a massive Portuguese ship named Nossa Senhora do Cabo. She had been damaged in a storm and the pirates were able to take her without too much of a fight. But the treasure aboard was really too much than they deserved for basically just being lucky. It has been estimated as the most valuable heist in pirate history, with values ranging from between 200 to 400 million US dollars in today's money. But it's not really certain. Most of it consisted of diamonds and rubies. There was also a fine collection of books and writings, which the pirates tore apart to make wadding for their muskets. The pirates of this era appear to have shown some form of hostility towards writing. Remnants of a book was also found as wadding in one of Blackbeard's cannons, and William Snelgrave, who as I previously mentioned spent several weeks in the captivity of Taylor and his friends, remarked the following. Soon after we were on board, we all went into the great cabin, where we found nothing but destruction. 2 scrutories, a type of desk, I had there were broke to pieces, and all the fine goods and necessaries in them were all gone. Moreover, 2 large chests that had books in them were empty, and I was afterwards informed they had been all thrown overboard. For one of the pirates, upon opening them, swore they was jawwork enough, as he called it, to serve a nation, and proposed they might be cast into the sea, for he feared there might be some books amongst them that might breed mischief enough, and prevent some of their comrades from going on their voyage to hell, whither they were all bound, upon which the books were all flung out of the cabin windows into the river. Basically, books were destroyed both to lighten the ship and as a move of censorship. As quartermaster, Taylor would have led the boarding party in charge of taking the Nossa Senhora. However, the victory would have been commanded by Levasseur, and the mysterious Jasper Seeger was most likely in charge of the entire operation, since he commanded the biggest ship. Taylor was only given credit for rescuing the ship's commander, after he bravely resisted until his sword broke. But Levasseur was the one to negotiate for his ransom, and he also managed to release Richard Lazenby, perhaps purely to spite Taylor. Taylor was no doubt looking for revenge, and he would later claim credit for the capture, and invent several details about the capture never mentioned elsewhere. It was customary among pirates for the quartermaster to receive the first ship they captured. Taylor was given command of the Cabo and rechristened her the Defense. They carried her to St. Mary's Island, where she was refitted into a proper pirate ship. They cut down the upper sections, reducing the decks from 3 to 2.5. Cannons were added, boosting the total armament to a whopping 70 guns. She had now become the largest and most heavily armed pirate ship of all history. She could take on pretty much anything. The leaking Victory was burned, and Levasseur took command of the Cassandra, after Captain Seeger passed away on Madagascar. Wow, that has never happened before. At St. Augustine Bay, the locals gave the pirates a letter from a certain Commodore Matthews. He had been sent from London at the head of a small squadron, designated to hunt Taylor and the pirates down. Taylor opened the letter and read it before the ship's company, giving an account of all the ships, their commanders, their number of men and guns. However, Taylor did not show any fear. To the surprise of his men, he had been informed previously of these so-called pirate hunters, and likewise of their incompetence. Commodore Matthews had no intentions of engaging in such an unprofitable activity as pirate hunting. Instead, he was looking to enrich himself through trade. They returned to St. Mary, where they spent the following 10 months just partying. News of Matthews' encroachment made him wary, some speculating that he might be looking to trade with them, others that they could take him on. Both Levasseur and Taylor were cautious and decided to pull away. They left behind tons of valuable goods like china and cloth just lying on the shore. Unlike the piratical entrepreneurs of the previous century, these scalawags were simply looking to blow their money on liquor and sex. Though escape had probably been a good decision, it wasn't really necessary. Matthews was looking to trade and engaged politely with several of the retired pirates, like Edward England and John Plantain. Perhaps this is why England refused to give details about Taylor and Levasseur's whereabouts, because the Navy specifically didn't want to hurt them. It might seem like corruption, and in a sense it was, but also not. Matthews had been sent to hunt pirates, but the concern was more so the Marathi pirates under Kanoji Angria, rather than Taylor and Levasseur. Angria commanded a force of some 1,500 men and 11 ships. Taylor and his friends were small time in comparison. The English did not really care about the pirates taking a Portuguese ship, and though they had taken the Cassandra, it belonged to the East India Company, whom the Navy weren't too fond of. The pirates rounded the southern tip of Madagascar and crossed the Mozambique Channel over to Africa. In late April of 1722, they arrived at Fort Leadsamheit, a Dutch outpost at Delagoa Bay. The fort had not finished construction and it was severely undermanned after an outbreak of malaria, allowing the pirates to take it without a fight. They likewise captured 2 ships lying in the harbour. They spent the next 5 months occupying the fort, no doubt pickling themselves with the ample stores of brandy and arrack. Some speculate that they intended to use the fort as a means of defense in case Matthews decided to come after them. After having plundered the surrounding countryside, the pirates loaded the stolen provisions and departed, taking with them 22 Dutchmen, including the hydrographer Jacob de Bucquoy. As I mentioned previously in the video, he provides us with a detailed account of his time in captivity, and a very colourful view of Captain Taylor. The account should be taken with a pinch of salt. Bucquoy seems to have had a Stockholm Syndrome thing going on with Taylor. He wrote his account 2 decades after it happened, and it might have been twisted as a slight critique against the incompetence of the VOC. This critique may have come in the form of descriptions of the pirates' discipline, and meant to be a contrast to the discipline aboard VOC ships. Bucquoy wrote how duties are carried out in an orderly fashion, better even than on ships of the India Company. The pirates take great pride in this. They exercised continually at target practice and at scrimmaging with wooden sabers or rapiers. Meanwhile, their musicians play such melodies that the days pass most agreeably. They eat but once a day and always with good appetite, for hunger makes the best cook. They are usually short of rations. While such a discipline appears to have been in line with Taylor's background as a naval officer, it does contrast with the less than stellar description by Lazenby. Of course, Lazenby was an officer and Bucquoy a hydrographer, so their criteria for discipline were no doubt different. And crucially, Bucquoy wrote how the pirate articles contained rules against desertion and promoted loyalty to the company. And pirates often had a taboo against anyone prematurely discussing retirement. After leaving Delagoa, Levasseur was now tiring of the pirate life. He and his officers were conspiring to abandon Taylor and sail to the West Indies, but several of his detractors fired a cannon and hoisted a black flag, a signal of distress. The pirates met in council and decided to confiscate all of Levasseur's treasure. He and his accomplices were bound at the foot of the mainmast and flogged. However, he was allowed to keep his captaincy. Taylor certainly did this to revenge himself on Levasseur for previously replacing him as captain of the Victory. Indeed, Bucquoy's account makes it quite clear that Taylor was jealous of Levasseur stealing the glory from him by taking the Cabo, and he did in fact twist the details of the story. He told Bucquoy that it was he, Taylor, who defeated the Cassandra alone, and that it was him who had taken the Cabo, not Levasseur. His bloated ego became apparent when he proposed the plans of attacking the well-defended city of Mozambique. When the pirates said they needed at least 6 times as many ships and men, Taylor exclaimed, If we could ascend to heaven, I would fire my first gun at God. And then he went on for several minutes, recounting some of his deeds. Yada yada, the pirates didn't buy it. They were already rich enough, and voted for returning to Madagascar. Taylor called them cowards, but was forced to comply. Having been a victim and the perpetrator of several intrigues, Taylor had now organized the crew as to better assert his authority. The crew were divided into messes of 7 men, consisting of different nationalities. One consisted of a Frenchman, a Swede, a Portuguese, and 3 or 4 Englishmen. This put the different men in opposition to each other, preventing them from conspiring against the captaincy. Of course, he was still easily angered and quite a schizo. Whenever he suspected mutinous sentiment, he would himself descend into the discussion and just beat everyone up with his bare hands, quote, as if he had no more to do than scatter pigeons in a courtyard. He even went so far as to outlaw quarrels, insults, religious discussions, and gambling for money between the crewmen, in order to ensure stability. Perhaps it was fear, but Bucquoy claims that the pirates loved him. He would often come down to converse, play, eat or drink with them. Whilst many pirates strived for equality aboard their ship, everyone sharing the same conditions, Taylor kept his vessel in a Royal Navy fashion. The officers segregated from the common men in their cabin. The officers ate different food, and he likewise treated his prisoners with respect, though he told them not to whisper among themselves, in order to avoid the crew's suspicions. Bucquoy shared the same cabin as Taylor, so he got the honor of witnessing several of his episodes. He writes the following. It often happened to him to awaken with a start, as if seized with terror, and, uttering some horrible blasphemies, to extend his hand towards his pistols, which were hanging within his reach. Thus awakened, he rose to his feet, looked on all sides, and seeing that no danger threatened him, lay again. If he did not fall asleep again, he would gladly talk with me. Indeed, the piratical career was taking a toll on the captain's life. According to Bucquoy, Taylor called it a horror of that life, which was only good for the rabble, perhaps also an indication of some highborn background. Indeed, despite his talks of bravado, it seems he was tiring of the lifestyle. On the 1st of September, 1722, the pirates dropped anchor at the Bay of Boini, on the west coast of Madagascar. They were met by King Radocafe and his retinue of 2,000 warriors, giving him gifts and kissing his hand. The pirates were given food and women, and set up a camp in which to divide their plunder. Bucquoy and his fellow Dutchmen asked to be given one of the prize ships, which they had actually been promised. The pirates declined. Instead, they renamed the prize Greyhound and gave it to a Scotsman named Captain Elk. Ironically, the Dutchmen were forced to work on the refitting, but they would take their time to hide away tools and supplies, which they would later use for their own escape. When the pirates finally left, the Dutch were simply left behind. The pirates gathered aboard the Defense and held a vote on who wanted to keep pirating and who wanted to seek a pardon. Previously, it was Taylor who wished to pirate and Levasseur who planned to retire, but ironically, the tables had now been switched. Taylor had tired of the life, and Levasseur had lost all of his plunder after his punishment. Levasseur was given command of the Superior Defense, and Taylor boarded the Cassandra, along with 112 white men and 40 blacks. At least some of these African gentlemen seemed to have been freemen, as they were described as partaking in the vote. Before departing, the officers met in the cabin for a farewell toast. Naturally, they had one too many and broke into an argument. Levasseur managed to provoke Taylor, and offered a fight between their ships. Taylor told him the proposal was absurd and disgraceful, and asked Levasseur if he made it out of some resentment for having recently been punished. He took full responsibility for the punishment, saying it was not up to his crew to pay for, and that Levasseur was a coward who did not trust in his personal courage. Taylor was red with anger and broke into a bout of swearing and blasphemy. He turned to the bystanders, saying, "If you are like him, I am ready. Go ahead, and I will give you satisfaction with a pistol or saber." No one dared to take up the challenge. On this sour note, the pirates separated. Levasseur sailed north, but was shipwrecked on Madagascar. He would later take a pardon from the governor of Bourbon, but instead of retiring on that island as the amnesty demanded, he settled down as a pilot and slave trader on Madagascar instead. This would later result in his arrest and execution in 1730. Unjustly so, some have argued. If you wish to learn more about Levasseur, I'll direct you towards my recently published video about him, which is really a sister episode to this one, and contains a lot of complementary information. Taylor and his pirates were now looking for a pardon from a generous monarchy. The most obvious one was offered by the governor of Bourbon, whom they had previously made dealings with. Several pirates on Madagascar had been trying for several years to acquire a pardon from the King of Sweden, who had Jacobite sympathies and was somewhat interested in a Madagascar colony. The strangest proposition came from Peter the Great of Russia, the Swedish rival, who offered asylum to Taylor and his men at Archangel. It was no doubt a bit too nippy for those tropical thugs, and they opted instead for a return to the Caribbean. Taylor probably wanted to get as far away as possible from Levasseur. The Cassandra arrived in the West Indies by spring of 1723. They sailed for the island of Pines in the Bay of Panama, where old buccaneers like Bartholomew Roberts had hid out. From here they sent out 2 piraguas to seek contact with the Spanish. They met a Spanish sloop, which told them that the governor of Portobello would give them pardons. Taylor agreed. For a payment of 50 crowns, the sloop delivered Richard Moore as an emissary to the Spanish governor. Moore had been held as a captive for several years, and his assignment as an emissary would eventually allow his long-anticipated release. The Royal Navy soon learned of Taylor's ambition, and sent him the proposal of a British pardon instead. They wanted to secure the Cassandra for the benefit of the Crown. The negotiations were surprisingly civil, with Taylor eventually travelling himself, though he kept a hostage in the form of the brother of Joseph Laws, captain of the HMS Mermaid. The situation was quite delicate, since both the British and Spanish wanted to acquire the Cassandra and a share of the prize money. Taylor bargained with both in order to get the optimal deal. Governor Badillo tried to invite the pirates into Portobello in order to bring the Cassandra under the security of his guns, but the pirates were cautious, and it didn't work. Captain Laws even went so far as to threaten to capture any Spanish vessel that approached and take them to court as pirates in Jamaica. Though Laws was quite eager, the governor of Jamaica ignored the first and second petitions sent by the pirates. Laws begged them to give him more time. The Spanish amnesty was looking more and more promising, as they swore not to take any of the pirates' money or goods. Taylor and his men finally agreed to the Spanish offer on the following conditions. Item 1. That none of the Protestant pirates should be forcefully converted to Catholicism. Item 2. That they should be allowed to keep all of their jewels, gold, silver, and merchandise as subjects of the King of Spain. Item number 3. That they should have the freedom to go to Europe, or wherever they pleased. Item number 4. That they should have the liberty to sell their slaves and merchandise without being disturbed in any way. Governor Badillo agreed, and even sent a contingent of sloops and soldiers to escort the pirates, in case the British decided to do anything stupid. Captain Laws was infuriated. The governor of Jamaica had proven entirely indifferent, and Laws wrote to him saying it was embarrassing that a group of English pirates who had stolen from every country except Spain were now being pardoned by the Spanish. He demanded that Badillo turned over the Cassandra, since it had been owned by the East India Company. None of it worked. HMS Mermaid returned unsuccessfully to Jamaica. He would continue to bicker with the governor for several weeks. Things were now growing embarrassing for Governor Portland, and he decided to blame Captain Laws and the Navy for the loss of the Cassandra. The blame game continued to go back and forth. Taylor was no doubt watching this from afar and having a giggle. As for the Cassandra, it ironically seems as though she was made into a guarda costa, a Spanish coast guard primarily meant to protect the shores of New Spain from Franco-English pirates, interlopers, and especially illegal logwood cutters. Eyewitnesses report seeing some of Taylor's men aboard Spanish guarda costas. As for the big, angry man himself, it's not entirely certain. Captain Charles Johnson wrote in a General History of the Pirates that Taylor took up a commission as a captain in the guarda costa. According to Jacob de Bucquoy, he went to Jamaica, where he had a wife and 4 children. He remained there until he recklessly expended most of his money. With the rest he bought a plantation on Cuba, as well as a small bark which he used for trading with the neighboring islands. By 1744, Bucquoy claimed that Taylor was still at it. Whatever happened to him, perhaps he was able to find some semblance of peace. but he should still be regarded as one of the most successful pirates from the period. When compared to other new roundsmen who sailed out of Madagascar in the early 1720s. Cocklyn and Seager died on Madagascar, Edward England was marooned, Levasseur was executed, and Edward Condon retired as a merchant with a French wife. I think Condon was the ultimate winner, but Taylor is definitely a close second. In one of my recent live streams, I was asked if I would ever do another one of those art challenges that I did last year on Captain Jack Sparrow, so here we are, I suppose. I challenge you to draw Richard Taylor as you imagine him, preferably a little bonus if you illustrate him from one of those scenes presented throughout this video. And when I've received a sufficient amount of submissions, I'll make a video or probably a live stream discussing all of the pieces. And I'll also provide any links you want to your social media account, so you can get some attention. You can send your submissions via Discord, you'll find an invite to the Discord server in the video description, or you can send it to me via email, you'll find my email address on the channel page. And if you enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy the biography on Taylor's associate, Olivier Levasseur, which was published around 2 months ago, or perhaps another one of the many videos on the Pirates of the Indian Ocean, which I've published in the recent months. I also have a special offer for you, as I've recently teamed up with a small Washington-based company named Mythology Candles, who produce all sorts of fantasy-themed candles like this one from their recent selection, Skull and Crossbones, which is of course pirate-themed candles. This one is called Captain's Quarters. I actually received 2 of these candles, but I gifted one of them to my mom. This one has a sort of leathery smell, a lot of vanilla, very pleasant. And if you use my affiliate link presented somewhere on the screen or in the video description or pinned comment below, you'll receive a 10% discount, and I will also receive a slice of the profits. And I will of course then use your hard-earned money to snort substances and buy prostitutes. But it will be very romantic, since the entire place would be lit up by mythology candles. You can otherwise support my hedonistic lifestyle by becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter, or making a one-time donation via PayPal or even the YouTube donation button. You'll find all of the links in the video description. And of course, these videos do not make themselves. And aside from just surviving, I eventually want to move out of this lovely Klaus Schwab Point pod and into the countryside, at some point at least. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you again soon.